Under a full moon, the sorceress descended above the castle, cloaked in purple light. The protagonist stood below and watched with narrowed eyes. She landed on the battlements and clenched her hands, summoning curling shadow tendrils. Her speech appeared as dark captions and carried a mocking tone. The protagonist drew a blade and set his feet, chest tightening against the cold. Tendrils unfurled toward him as the sorceress smiled and darkness pooled. He braced for impact while the castle shadows answered her command and coalesced. The scene held on that instant before violence descended across the moonlit courtyard. The sorceress extended her shadow tendrils and struck the protagonist under the moon. The tendrils seized him and lifted him into the air as he screamed. Darkness wrapped his body and forced him through a rupturing void above the courtyard. He fell and hit the sea far below, sinking then surfacing gasping and laughing. Rage and pain lined his face as he spat curses and swore vengeance at the sorceress. She remained on the rift's edge, composed, watching the protagonist struggle in the water beneath her. The protagonist fell through the rift and struck cold water beneath the moon. He sank, then forced himself up coughing, blood and salt on his lips. A glowing device plunged after him, trailing blue energy through the tearing void. He spat curses and screamed defiance toward the rift while gasping for air. The sorceress watched from the rift's edge, composed and unmoving as always. Minutes later, he sat in a quiet lecture hall, clutching the device and scowling. He studied the artifact's glow, measuring its pulse like a distant countdown. Silence closed around him as the object thrummed, promising answers or revenge. The protagonist checked his phone and stared at the bright notification list. He felt the device pulse again and kept the screen close for confirmation. Above the city, a new rift opened and flooded the night with light. Beams dropped down from the sky and figures poured through the ruined streets. Citizens ran and wreckage spread as distant sirens cut the air in alarm. Trained combatants emerged from the chaos, charging with blades, guns, and spells. Lightning arced between a fallen aircraft and a summoner on the street. The artifact's hum matched each strike and pulled attention toward the sky. The sky had split and shadowed forms spilled into the streets, while the city's lights answered with alarm. A towering figure advanced amid the rift's light. The sorceress seized the protagonist and led him into still water where he sank toward black depths. He jolted upright on a city road, holding a pulsing phone. The notification pulled him as much as the sky above, and he rose with the device, intently drawn toward the widening breach and the hum that threaded through the night. The protagonist moved through a hospital wing with his phone still pulsing softly. He passed a collapsed stranger and a pair of doctors in the hall. He paused at a closed door, then entered a curtained room. On the bed, a bound patient lay gagged and bleeding from his mouth. The protagonist retrieved a syringe filled with a glowing purple fluid. He connected it to the patient's IV and withdrew the bright liquid. He examined the vial, pocketed it, and left the ward without speaking. He walked back into the corridor burdened and resolved by the theft. The protagonist held the syringe filled with purple fluid and eyed it in his hand. He hesitated, then pushed the needle into his forearm and drew the serum. Pain and panic struck him, and he clawed at his chest as his legs buckled. The corridor floor gave way, and he plunged through, falling into a cavernous dark space below. Above him, the sorceress hovered, her hands tracing runes and light. She spoke and wove a glowing circle that pinned him in place while he lay stunned and breathless. He still felt the sorceress's runes as a cold aftershock. The protagonist regained consciousness on a hard floor and pushed himself up, breath ragged and furious. He berated himself for the fall and staggered toward a balcony that opened onto a bright courtyard. He screamed until his throat burned, and the shout sent nearby bystanders scattering in alarm. He hurried back into the corridor and confronted two medical staff at a doorway. They recoiled and shouted while he stood bloodied, unsteady, and intensely watchful as they kept their distance. He moved into a small restroom and said he would wash his face. He stood before the mirror and tested the glass with a tired hand. The reflection answered back and gave him an uneasy pause. A shaft of light poured down, and a purple holographic panel unfolded above his head. Lines of luminous text and options scrolled across the interface he could barely read. He reached up and touched the display, feeling a cold prickle run down his fingers. The room shifted around his grip as a dark pulse gathered into his palm. After testing the mirror, the protagonist touched the floating interface. The holographic panel activated and displayed Innate Ability Panel, Virus Monarch SSS. A cold light traveled along his fingers as a dark pulse gathered in his palm. Shadows behind him thickened and resolved into a monstrous silhouette tied to him. The figure towered but remained fused with the protagonist's outline. Energy wrapped his limbs and left faint purple motes in the air. He felt a new status settle across his vision and chest. The protagonist activated an innate panel that labeled his ability Virus Monarch SSS. Cold light traced his fingers while a dark pulse gathered in his palm. Shadows thickened behind him and resolved into a towering figure fused to his outline. Energy wrapped his limbs and left faint purple motes in the air. Explanatory text defined the Virus Monarch's domain and listed its uses and limits. He concluded a strong external energy source was required to expand the power. Later, he reached a rooftop where a falling crate scattered people and urgent cries drew his gaze toward the chaos. The protagonist remembered Virus Monarch and its dependence on outside energy. He reached the rooftop where a falling crate scattered people and triggered urgent cries. A bystander shouted, "Zombies," and panic rippled through the crowd. He let cold light gather at his fingers and purple motes drifted around him. He looked down at the nearby hospital and judged it the best energy source. A patient lay strapped amid the chaos. The protagonist stepped forward and launched himself at the threat, determined to shield the bystanders and draw the external power he needed. The protagonist had let cold light gather at his fingers and purple motes drift around him. He knelt over the strapped patient and funneled external energy into the man's chest. Text declared Virus Monarch's latent soul virus absorption as the power flowed through him. The protagonist then rose and warned the crowd that none could escape today. Panic returned as infected figures poured down the stairs toward the hospital entrance. Meanwhile, someone forced through hospital doors inside, and urgent sounds echoed down the corridor. The protagonist had channeled energy into the patient and warned that none could escape. The scene then cut to the hospital's fourth-floor restroom corridor, where voices echoed. Shouting men yelled and rushed toward the landing as glass shattered. An infected lunged into the stairwell and struck the railing and bent metal. A pink-haired nurse crouched against a wall and cried until the panicked man pleaded with her for help. They argued softly about what to do next before silence fell and footsteps grew louder. Masked assailant then appeared at the corridor mouth and grinned menacingly. He spoke while stepping forward, and the room held its breath for a moment. After the masked attacker's appearance, the corridor erupted. A pink-haired nurse demanded that Lai Feng explain himself. A pale hand smashed through the floor as an infected lunged upward. A man screamed that he did not want to die. The nurse recoiled, and others grabbed her to pull her away. The group tumbled into motion and ran down the hall. A runner sprinted toward a glass door and noted the floor below was the same one they feared. Footsteps and shouting trailed after them as the scene dissolved into motion. The group ran blind down the corridor as the ceiling suddenly gave way above them. A figure crashed through glass and plunged into the hall among the runners. Shards exploded outward and bodies were thrown by the blast and impact. The protagonist landed hard and gasped, blood and glass on his shirt. A beat passed before the noise faded and footsteps trailed away down the hall. Several minutes later, the scene had quieted into scattered bodies and a vacant stairwell. After the ceiling collapsed, the protagonist stood over a pink-haired woman on the floor. He crouched and searched for a pulse with steady hands. He spoke aloud that there should still be time and stayed focused. Thought bubbles warned the military would arrive soon and could alter the plan. He moved down the hallway past fallen survivors toward the stairwell and exit. His face hardened with resolve as he planned who to save first. After the ceiling collapsed, the protagonist had crouched over the pink-haired woman and checked her pulse. He kept watch for approaching military and moved toward the stairwell past wounded people. Pink-haired woman stirred and blinked open her eyes when his hand left her forehead. She sat up slowly and thanked him, voice trembling. They exchanged brief questions about the attack and her condition. She asked for clothes before anything else. The protagonist agreed and moved off to find something to wear while staying alert. After the collapse, the protagonist had helped the pink-haired woman and then moved through the hall. He led her to the laboratory entrance, where a fallen body lay by the door. Inside, they reached a service counter and argued about the facility and test subjects. The pink-haired woman asked what he planned while he prepared vials and tubes at the bench. He told her to be quiet, then announced a risky method he called virus absorption. He placed his hand near the samples and focused his power into a cooling device. The apparatus pulsed, and the infection streamed into his palm as an eerie light. Both waited to see whether the absorption would neutralize or overwhelm him. After he drew the infection into his palm, the protagonist watched a branching map form around him. Each branch bore a label: decay virus, T-virus, oxyvirus, and repeated dark light virus nodes. He observed the patterns and considered their reach. Peripheral lights pulsed along the branches as the apparatus faded. A distant voice shouted that zombies were coming at the door. The pink-haired woman stepped closer, alarm on her face. The protagonist held up his hands and ordered her not to move. After mapping the infection branches, he noticed movement at the doorway and tensed. A lone figure stepped into the corridor while pink-haired woman watched from nearby. The protagonist lunged and seized an older man's head to stop him. He said aloud he would test his new ability on the man. Dark purple tendrils erupted from the man's neck and face without warning. The tendrils coalesced into a writhing mass that rustled and lashed outward. The protagonist maintained his grip and examined the creature's motion closely. The protagonist held the older man's head and studied the writhing mass. He extended his hand, and dark purple tendrils streamed out to circle the creature. He spoke a single command, and the tendrils enveloped and drew the mass into his palm. The force collapsed inward until only a faint stain remained on his skin. Pink-haired woman stepped forward trembling and tearful and called out that he had saved her. The protagonist met her stare and then promised he would keep her secret for now. The protagonist helped pink-haired woman to her feet and confirmed her name as Suzin. He warned that medics and police were approaching and urged they leave by the roof. They moved quickly down the hospital corridor and argued briefly about rescuing others. He insisted they head to the rooftop and leave from there. They turned a corner and ran beneath loose ceiling panels. A pale infected figure crashed through the ceiling and hung above them with a wide mouth and bright eyes. The protagonist looked up and braced for the attack. The protagonist and pink-haired woman moved beneath loose ceiling panels toward the rooftop exit. A ceiling tile fell away and an infected figure slammed through the gap. The creature dropped with a wide mouth and bright eyes and struck the floor. Pink-haired woman froze and cried out in sudden fear as the monster reared to attack. The protagonist braced himself and stepped forward to meet the immediate threat. The hallway rocked from the impact and dust fell from broken tiles. They faced the lunging assailant in the narrow corridor with no help visible. The protagonist and pink-haired woman moved down the corridor beneath loose ceiling tiles toward the rooftop exit. An infected crashed through a gap and dropped between them with a wide mouth and bright eyes. Pink-haired woman froze and cried out while the protagonist stepped forward to meet the threat. He grimaced as blood stained his palm from a fresh wound. He smiled with a hard edge and timed a movement precisely. The infected lunged. The protagonist sidestepped and kicked the creature into the floor. Dust fell and the corridor echoed as the monster writhed, its eyes glowing red. The protagonist vaulted and kicked the infected into the floor as dust and tiles fell. The creature recovered and lunged with glowing red eyes. It bore down through the corridor as the protagonist moved to shield pink-haired woman. She lay stunned and emitted a pale purple light. Shadowy tendrils of power coalesced around the protagonist and her. He seized the surge and formed a dark blade of energy. He drove it through the infected, striking its skull and sending it crashing against the ceiling. The protagonist landed, chest heaving, while the creature slumped broken on the tiles. The protagonist had driven a dark blade through the infected and landed chest, heaving on the tiles. He took a breath and scanned the corridor immediately for more threats. A heavy impact shattered a glass case and sent shards across the floor. A pink-haired woman in a nurse uniform stumbled free, stunned and pale, her eyes wide. He moved to shield her as another infected lunged from the wreckage. Axes spun into view, and an attacker suddenly charged through the doorway. The protagonist met the strike with a red energy arc that cut deep. The protagonist drove the blade and forced the attacker back along the corridor. He shielded the pink-haired woman and struck again with a red energy arc that cleaved through flesh. Axes and blades flashed as a muscular infected charged roaring toward them. The protagonist met each assault with quick slashes and pushed the group back. Bodies flew from his strikes and attackers scattered across the floor. He planted a boot, shouted "Go to hell," and drove the momentum upward. A skull-faced infected with glowing red eyes rose and filled the frame. The protagonist kept advancing while an axe flashed past his foot and missed. He struck a gray infected, and blood sprayed across the floor. He steadied himself and glared as attackers regrouped. A skull-faced infected dropped down with a single glowing red eye and closed distance rapidly. The protagonist met the charge and was hit hard by a brutal swing that drove him backward. He coughed blood and screamed as pain flared. The pink-haired woman recoiled and watched the scene with wide alarm. The protagonist had been driven backward and coughed blood after a brutal swing. The pink-haired woman recoiled and watched in alarm. The protagonist steadied his hands and spoke a short line. The skull-infected lunged again. He let a dark purple energy flare from his core. Twisting tendrils shot out and wrapped the assailant. The tendrils tightened and swallowed the skull-infected, muting its snarl. Blood stained the floor as motion ceased. The protagonist rose with a cold smile, and his eyes glowed red while observers fell silent. The pink-haired woman watched as purple energy crawled across the tiled floor nearby. Text boxes announced a mysterious black core and an emerging black light virus. The protagonist felt the virus propagate through his body, and small mutterings escaped him. Tendrils of dark energy coalesced and formed clawed appendages along his hand. He stood with blood staining the floor, and his eyes flared red beneath the purple glow. Soldiers raised rifles from the doorway and trained them on his figure. He relaxed his shoulders and met their aim with a cold, steady gaze. Soldiers advanced into the corridor and trained rifles on the protagonist and the pink-haired woman. The squad counted down as they prepared to fire. The protagonist kept the woman close and used his body as a shield while the team aimed. A glowing green device flashed and discharged a bright pulse across the floor. The blast rattled tiles and scattered debris down the hall. The pink-haired woman cried out as both recoiled. The protagonist held her steady and pulled her toward cover while the corridor rang with the aftershock. Soldiers had trained rifles on the protagonist and the pink-haired woman as the squad counted down. A green device flashed and released a hard pulse that rattled tiles and sent debris skittering. The protagonist pulled the woman to safety and carried her up and onto a sunlit rooftop. He set her briefly and checked for a response as she blinked and stammered. Suddenly, a figure launched from a neighboring roof and fell past them with a wild cry. The protagonist tightened his grip, ran along the rooftop, and vaulted a gap while holding her as the city spread below. After the rooftop escape, they reached a modest apartment. The protagonist closed the door and removed his jacket. The pink-haired woman steadied herself in the doorway and watched him. He checked the small bathroom and set a towel on the sink. Clothes lay in a neat pile on the floor. He peeled off his shirt and stood bare-chested while she held her blouse to her chest. They exchanged guarded glances. Close shots showed his eyes and her flushed face as the room held a quiet pause while they recovered and caught their breath. They escaped the rooftop and entered a modest apartment to catch their breath and regroup. The protagonist closed the door, removed his jacket, and scanned the small bathroom quickly. Pink-haired woman steadied herself in the doorway and held her blouse to her chest nervously. They shared guarded looks, each measuring the other's state and willingness to proceed. Hesitation gave way to touch. Clothing came off as proximity warmed their caution. He leaned in and their kiss deepened. Then she murmured a soft consent, "Okay." They moved under the shower together. Steam filled the room and the door clicked shut. A phone began to buzz down the hall with new messages visible on its screen. They left the rooftop and briefly shared a private moment in a cramped apartment. Steam eased them, and a phone began buzzing down the hall. Later, the protagonist walked through city streets under alert and past a sealed hospital ringed with smoke. Reports showed a slaughtered ward and monstrous figures in dark frames. Flames and rubble marked the route as he went. A sudden call interrupted him, and he listened. Suited agents arrived nearby. Pink-haired woman paused in a doorway and weighed what to do next. He checked his phone and read a string of urgent messages on the screen. He kept his face neutral as a darker thought flickered at his eyes. A high-speed train thundered through the station and stirred dust and smoke. Two suited agents came up, one offering steady support and the other blocking bystanders. They guided him to a waiting vehicle parked under the station canopy. A striking woman in a dress stood across the lot and held his glance briefly. He moved toward the building, agents flanking him as a dark-haired woman watched from above. The striking woman walked across the station plaza, flanked by a silent escort. She kept her gaze fixed and reached out as she closed distance. He met her with a guarded expression and listened without moving too. She touched his chest, then smiled, lowering her voice as she spoke. He looked torn, eyes flicking between her face and the empty platform. She guided him forward with a light pull, and they started walking. At the station steps he paused, watched her turn once and leave. She glanced back with a confident smile before she disappeared into the building. He flinched at the sudden voice and held himself still as thoughts ran. He questioned what followed him and rode the elevator with guarded focus. A poised woman stood in the corridor when the doors opened, calm and composed. His phone showed a thread naming the woman. Two women exchanged a brief cold remark and spoke her name aloud. Hearing that name snapped his breath away, and he slumped backward. Darkness closed around his vision, while a last caption hinted someone already knew the next target. He woke beside pink-haired woman, and they traded light, teasing as morning light spread across the sheets. They spoke of small things and of what came next. He rose and checked his phone, seeing a thread that named a woman he had seen earlier. In the corridor, the named woman waited, composed and unreadable. Another woman made a cold remark and said her name aloud. Hearing it hit him like a physical weight. He went pale and tried to steady himself. His vision dimmed and consciousness slipped away, leaving the moment unresolved. He walked into the corridor and found the named woman waiting, composed and unreadable. He exchanged a few words, then formed purple energy in his hands and declared the other should be him. The women tensed, and one answered him with a cold, corrective remark. He pressed the power toward her, and the contact proved wrong. He moved closer and wrapped an arm around pink-haired woman, whispering a pleading line to steady himself. The pair traded guarded looks as the moment held, tense and unresolved, with his face hard and uncertain decisions hanging between them. Protagonist approached the woman and exchanged measured words that tested their boundaries. The woman responded with a cool retort and then eased into cooperation. They shook hands to seal a tentative agreement. Protagonist kept an arm around pink-haired woman and whispered for calm. Their faces held guarded attraction and unresolved tension. A sudden bang interrupted the moment and sent two others rushing forward. The fragile truce broke into urgent motion. Unknown woman shouted questions, while shouting man stared stunned as the corridor erupted into alarm. After the bang, unknown woman shouted urgent questions, while shouting man stared stunned. Officers and a nurse moved through the corridor to control the crowd. The protagonist released his hold on pink-haired woman as the dark-haired woman spoke coldly and directed action. Security radioed for backup. The protagonist drew a glowing device and read a flashing alert on its screen. The alert showed multiple breaches and a location marker. Soldiers arrived and took positions at the corridor mouth. From the shadowed end, a writhing mass of infected rushed forward. The line held only briefly before the first infected crashed through and the scene exploded into violence. An energy device slipped from a soldier's grasp and tumbled down the corridor. It spun past helmets and fell away. A skull-faced infected lunged from the smoke and screamed, its muscles tearing. Dust and white vapor swallowed the line as more infected surged forward. The soldiers staggered, coughing and firing blindly as the front rank broke. A colossal infected raised a bloodied fist and roared, scattering debris. An officer barked terse orders into his radio, while a composed unknown woman stepped through the haze. She moved toward the chaos and watched the ruined corridor, expression unreadable. An officer halted the woman in black and exchanged terse words with her near the corridor. She folded her hands and stepped forward without haste. A young woman in a skirt was suddenly thrown to the floor as the officer barked. The woman in black smiled, then unleashed a purple surge. It struck a man in blue squarely in the chest. The blast threw him and several nearby soldiers backward into dust and broken masonry. Limbs and uniforms tore under the force. Blood splattered across the floor as wounded men collapsed and groaned. Silence followed the shock. Silence followed the shock. Debris and dust settled as a hulking infected rose from the wreckage, its torn uniforms and broken limbs hanging. The protagonist approached across the courtyard, beneath a clear sky. An officer and the dark-haired unknown woman exchanged a terse look before stepping back with other soldiers and bystanders. The protagonist entered a shattered corridor and found a piled mound of bloodied flesh and ruined bodies. Suddenly, purple tendrils burst from the mass and snaked around his legs. He tried to pull free as the tendrils tightened and bled into the floor. Outside, stunned onlookers could only watch. Silence followed the shock as dust settled and the hulking infected reared up. The protagonist forced through the shattered corridor and charged across the courtyard under a clear sky. He climbed the creature despite purple tendrils that had lashed at his legs moments before. On the beast's back, he drew breath, then shouted that it was the creature's turn to die. Dark violet energy gathered around his arm and flared into a focused beam. The blast struck the skull-infected skull, and the beast collapsed with a guttural roar. Soldiers, the officer, unknown woman, and bystanders watched stunned as the threat fell silent. After the beast collapsed, silence held as dust fell and watchers stared. The protagonist pushed free from wreckage, but purple tendrils burst from the fallen skull-infected and seized him. He was yanked into the air and spun, the dark energy wrapping his limbs. Soldiers and the officer shouted, and the protagonist tightened his control and smiled. He tore the tendrils apart and flung the skull and dark mass across the courtyard. Rubble and dust rose high as the corpse struck stone and crumbled. The officer and nearby bystanders watched the scattered remains smolder and settle. After the skull collapsed and the crowd watched, the officer regained composure and reacted. He reached into his pocket and lifted his radio. He issued terse orders and moved to secure the courtyard perimeter. A static reply crackled, but no immediate threat reappeared. A hand touched the officer's shoulder and forced him to pause. Two women observed from the steps and leaned in as tension thinned. One wore a dark dress and stepped forward with slow, deliberate grace. Her eyes narrowed and a small smile formed, signaling focused intent as dust drifted upward into the night. 10 minutes later, the courtyard remained guarded and silent beneath pale light. Officers trained rifles on the open ground and issued quiet commands by radio. The protagonist lay face up, then began to spasm as a violet mist gathered around his body. A dark-dressed woman stepped forward and held her hand steady, channeling the rising force. Two agents flanked her and radioed warnings as the energy intensified. Spectators froze and the officer reached for restraint but could not intervene. The energy rose and lifted the protagonist off the ground into a crackling purple field. Officers tightened their grips as the purple field shivered around the protagonist. The mist coalesced into a serrated appendage and slammed through the air near him. The protagonist staggered under the burst, but reached into the field and seized its edge. The energy did not burn him. Instead, it folded to his will and reshaped into a gauntlet around his arm. He flexed the newly formed hand and examined the solid mass with quiet interest. He thought the manifestation proved his control and converted the spectral armor into physical form. He smiled and called it the biggest gain of the day. After the gauntlet had formed, he walked into open air and produced a small red sphere labeled Fire Mountain Core. He turned the orb beneath the sky and measured its possible strength and hazards. He considered whether he could convert it for his use, but remained cautious. He called a name, Chenbai, and a woman stepped forward, extended her hand, and introduced herself as Luli. He greeted her but did not release the core, keeping it in his palm as they exchanged introductions. Earlier he had formed the gauntlet and produced the Red Fire Mountain core. Luli stepped forward and introduced herself, while the protagonist kept the core in his palm. An officer soon appeared and claimed orders to escort the protagonist and the core to a secure facility. Smiles hardened as soldiers closed ranks. The group attacked without warning. The protagonist tried to resist but was outnumbered. Luli was seized and dragged away. He fell to the ground and clutched the core. He pulled a hood over his head and went silent, planning his next move as the guards restrained him. After the scuffle, the protagonist hid the Red Fire Mountain core beneath his hood. He left the city and walked along empty streets toward uncertain distance. Footprints traced his slow retreat across pale pavement under dim evening light. Later, he encountered figures debating whether to confront Boss Song immediately or wait. A subordinate offered to explain the incident to Boss Song without further delay. Boss Song refused to act until facts were known and properly verified first. Luli stepped forward and vowed she would handle the situation herself directly. An officer arrived and addressed Boss Song and Mr. Chen with urgent news immediately. After the earlier council, a dark-haired woman in red heels stepped onto stacked sacks. She addressed the arriving officers with a steady, sharp voice. The lead officer stiffened and turned toward her. A stern man in plain clothes warned him urgently. The protagonist then appeared in the doorway and drew everyone's gaze. The officer verified the protagonist's identity and issued a firm order to bring him over. Subordinates moved quickly to obey and closed around the protagonist. The woman watched without flinching as tension tightened and arrest became imminent. After the council confrontation, officers closed in around the protagonist while the dark-haired woman watched. A blond man stepped forward and announced he was Lu Heaming, the president of the first hospital. He exposed his arm and injected a small vial labeled zombie virus. The protagonist and Lu Heaming traded accusations about Su Jin. Lu Heaming claimed she had told him secrets and wanted the protagonist dead. The protagonist demanded proof and questioned how Su Jin could possibly be awake. Officers and bystanders recoiled as Lu Heaming revealed the vial and injected his arm. The protagonist demanded proof, and the crowd braced for an immediate fallout. Lu Heaming's face contorted, and he suddenly convulsed, purple energy flaring along his neck. He barked an accusation, then snarled the words that he was already dead. The infection wrapped itself around his form, and teeth bared as he lunged forward. The protagonist watched from close range, stunned and unable to intervene. Purple tendrils struck the air, and a hulking mass descended toward the nearest figures. Purple mass slammed into the lobby and bodies scattered across the floor. A spiraling tendril swept past the protagonist and coiled around his arm. He staggered, breath shallow, unable to break the grip of the dark energy. Bystanders scrambled away, shielding their faces from the flaring light. An unknown woman walked toward him, her heels tapping on tile, and she gripped his elbow to steady him. She led him through the shocked crowd, while the infection's glow faded into the air. They left the nearest area together with tense, measured steps. A purple mass slammed the lobby, and people collapsed onto the tiled floor around them. A spiraling tendril wrapped the protagonist's arm and squeezed until he staggered and coughed. Bystanders fled, shielding faces from the flare, while the infection's glow lingered in the air. An unknown woman cut through the crowd, heels clicking, and gripped his elbow to steady him. She led him away past shocked onlookers toward a small clearing near the entrance. There he turned, gave a faint smile, and said outcomes would depend on value and performance. Purple corruption burst into the lobby, and people fell across the tile. A tendril wrapped the protagonist's arm and squeezed until he staggered and coughed. Onlookers fled from the flare, while the infection's glow lingered. An unknown woman cut through the crowd to steady him and led him to a small clearing. He turned, smiled faintly, and said outcomes would depend on value and performance. The view then shifted to a city street where a white sedan drove. Inside, passengers invited Mr. Chen to dinner. The protagonist, warned not to disturb, sat and prepared before opening his inventory. After the lobby attack, the protagonist opened his inventory and examined the loot. He read each item description and dismissed most as low value or unusable. He muttered that the current haul was not worth the effort and that some items only served faction testing. He considered using a cart group to sell surplus goods and gather funds. He planned to recruit partners and funnel proceeds into a secure foundation. He tapped the floating prompt asking to confirm creating a cart group and hesitated, weighing convenience against possible exposure. After briefly weighing exposure risks, he confirmed the cart group's creation and named it. A system prompt acknowledged the new group, while the sorceress leaned close and spoke terms. He listened and hinted at recruiting partners to funnel proceeds into a secure foundation. 3 hours later, they were inside Song Zikyong's private villa reporting progress to the owner. They reviewed the haul and listed contraband items, including firearms and electronic devices. He finished with a terse summary of available goods, then fell silent. After cataloging contraband at Song Zikyong's villa, they gathered to review the haul. He finished with a terse summary, then sat back and offered a proposition. He framed the offer as sufficient to gain leverage and secure an advantage. The woman said that amount was not enough and asked to become his person. He replied that ability mattered first, and he did not need useless people. She countered that loyalty would be absolute, and she could provide it completely. She then listed influence money and status in Jiangcheng as her assets to offer. He closed by warning that rules and wills after the trial would be entirely new. After they reviewed the contraband at Song Zikyong's villa, the protagonist concluded with a terse proposition designed to secure leverage. Song Zikyong said the sum was insufficient and offered herself as a subordinate. He refused to take useless allies and insisted ability mattered first. She countered with promises of absolute loyalty and influence in Jiangcheng. He warned that rules and wills would change after the trial and then revealed 2 captured women as a demonstration. Song Zikyong probed the difference between staying local and playing elsewhere. He promised a stage and dominance and declared he would remain above her. She warned she would leave if dishonored and strode away. After the villa exchange, a woman knelt and pledged to serve the protagonist. He said little and watched her with a small smile. He praised her reputation and noted the emotional weight of her promise. He called the prospect exciting and asked to witness her charm in person. He lifted her chin and examined her face. She replied she had tasks for him to handle. The scene then cut to a quiet office where 2 women reacted to a sudden phone message. After the villa exchange, the office scene shifted to 2 women reading a phone message. Song Zikyong ordered Luli to forward Mr. Chen's video and to let him return to rest.